Well, good evening, everyone. How are you? Thanks for joining me tonight. My name is Lee Love, and this is the Friday evening photo mentor question and answer period that we do live every Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Pacific time. And if you're in other parts of the world, that would be 0100 Universal Coordinated Time. Again, thanks for joining me. If you're joining on the replay, again, thanks for tuning in. The purpose of this show is to answer questions for new photographers that are struggling with issues that maybe their question can't get their questions answered, or they just something that they want on their mind they want to ask somebody, and so I do my best to try and answer those questions every week. The reason I started this live broadcast every week was because, quite frankly, I got tired of seeing incorrect answers and myths repeated over and over again on forums and groups to new photographers. And some of the information is correct, but if you're talking to a new photographer, it may not be appropriate. So we'll talk about some of those things. So anyway, if you want to join us live, you can join us on Facebook or YouTube. If you go to facebook.photomentor.tv, that'll take you directly to our Facebook page. If you enter youtube.photomentor.tv, that'll take you directly to our YouTube page. But chances are, if you're watching this, then you probably already know that. So you're already so I hope you are at least. Anyway, let's see. So, got a bunch of good questions tonight. And again, if you want to leave a question, put it in the comments section of either the YouTube channel or the Facebook page. And I'd appreciate it if you put a Q in front of it with a colon, and then that'll make it pop up here on my software, and I'll be able to answer your question as quickly as possible. If you have questions that throughout the week or whatever you want to ask those later on, you can send an email to help@photomentor.tv, and I can respond to those directly, or we'll add them to next week's show, depending on the type of question that you're asking. Okay. So tonight I'm kind of gonna I'm gonna open the show up talking about the concept of editing. It's a big one I see over and over. I see a lot of these questions repeated, and the main reason is because I think people ask these same questions. They get asked over and over, and sometimes people answer and sometimes they don't. So the first one is a question that I see a lot, and it has to do with editing pictures. And Raj asks, is it necessary to edit pictures? Edited pictures look great, but they hide one's talents. This is a misconception, I think, by a lot of photographers, especially a lot of new photographers. There's kind of two categories of photo editing, in my opinion. There is the category of um, taking your image to the next level. In other words, taking your vision and expanding on it. And then there's the perspective of you're going to correct everything in Photoshop. I don't believe in the second level. I believe in getting it right in camera as much as possible. That you can spend weeks in front of a computer trying to correct an image that you could have fixed by just moving 6 inches to the left or right and taking something out of the person's head or background or something like that. If you just pay attention to your photos before you push that shutter, you don't have to spend a lot of time in post processing. In fact, one of the tips I tell people is if you will look in the four corners of the photo of their frame of your camera viewfinder right before you push that shutter, and look to see if there's something there you want to eliminate or you want to add, and that will make a big difference in your images. But the point is that you so you don't want to Photoshop is not a cure-all. It's not a cure-all for bad photography. It will help you, it will give you some, it will allow you to make some corrections. You can remove things, you can add things, you can do compositing. It's great for that, but it's not a cure-all for every picture. So the question about should you be editing your picture, I think helps if we put this into some perspective. So if we look at Ansel Adams, I've used his quotes quite a bit, and one of my favorite quotes. He says the negative is equivalent to the composer's score, and the print the performance. So what he's trying to say here is that the exposing the negative, in other words, capturing the image, is really only half of the process. The other half is what you do in the darkroom, whether it be digital or whether it be um, analog, meaning film. So the darkroom plays a very big role in your images and always has. Editing has always been a process of photography ever since even before we had digital photography. If you look at here's a picture I'll show you this right here. This is a picture showing, this was from a Magnum photographer. Magnum is a well-known agency that's been around for many, many decades. And if you look, you can see these are all the markups on the photo that the photographer gave to the lab tech of what they wanted to do. And you can see over on the right the changes. So look at the face. You can see the face is kind of dark. You can see the sign over here was hard to read. He lightened that up. He lightened the face up. And so there are a lot of changes that will happen there. Same thing with this photo here. Again, this is a famous photo. And you can see here her face was a little bit dark. He had the lab dodge and burn some of the her face, bring the highlights out there, and also bring some of the highlights in the car down here and on the reflections in the car. So photo editing has been something that's gone on forever. And in fact, if you look at this picture of Ansel Adams, is the one I showed you before. This is Moon over Hernandez. And this photo was a very, very difficult photo for him to take. It's one of his most famous photos, but he spent years getting this photo correct in the darkroom. So the editing process was severe on this project. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the history, it says Adams pulled over in order to get a better look at a photograph of this remarkable phenomenon. After setting up his equipment, he quickly realized he could not find his exposure meter. Without this tool, he would not be able to determine the proper exposure for the photograph and consequently could not capture the scene in all its glory. With some quick thinking and impressive prior knowledge of the moon's light per square foot, however, he was able to improvise. This allowed him to estimate the exposure without the light meter and capture a single negative before the light failed completely and the magical quality of the scene was gone forever. So we got one frame. But here's the important point. He took the precious film to a studio. Here he developed the negative with multiple water baths to bring out the stark tones, but found it difficult to print. Over the next few years, he repeatedly revised the negative, experimenting with different contrasts and printing techniques. Finally, in 1970s, he achieved a print equal to the original visualization that he could vividly recall. So here's a man who a lot of people would consider a purist. They assume that everything that the negative that came out of his camera was perfect every time. He didn't need to do anything to it, and nothing could be further from the truth. He had to work on his negatives. He had to work on his prints to get them exactly the way he wanted. So editing is a huge part of the process in photography. It's not something that it's not something that, as Raj says, it's not something, it looks great, but it hides one's talent. That is not true. It actually brings out your talent. There are many photos that I've taken that I will look at, and I'm not quite sure what message I want to convey with those photos. I'll take a photo and I'll look at it. Maybe I'll let it sit for a couple of weeks in my Lightroom catalog, and I don't know what the emotion is I want to convey. Is it a cool image? Is it a warm image? What do I want to do with an image? And so, as an artist, that's my interpretation. I am giving the audience my interpretation of what I think the scene should look like and what the emotion is that I want to convey. That is the part of the editing. So editing has been and always will be part of photography and should be considered the other aspect of art. It should be where the artist takes the image that they captured and brings it to fruition. It brings that image, that feeling, that emotion that they want to bring to the viewer to feel and to see. So editing is a huge part of our work. It's not necessarily there to be fixing mistakes, but it certainly can be there to enhance that original photo that we've taken. So anyway, that's something I wanted to bring out and talk about a little bit tonight, because I see that question over and over, and a lot of people don't seem to understand that we are not copy machines. That the photos that we take, our job is not to take an exact copy of the photo, of exactly what we is in front of us. Our job is to interpret that. Every time you make a decision as a photographer, you are editing the photo. The ISO you select, the lens you select, where you stand is a decision that you make. All of those things go into making the photo what they are. And those are all editing decisions. They may not seem like editing decisions to you, but they are. So the aperture, the shutter speed, the lens you select, wide angle, telephoto, whatever, is your interpretation of how you want to represent that scene. So again, we're not copy machines. We're not meant to be delivering a exact replica of what's in front of us. Our job as artists is to convey what we want the audience to see and to feel. Okay, let's see what else we got tonight. I hope that helps, by the way. Okay, so Jennifer says, when I try to use my camera in manual, the pictures turn out so dark. Why? Oh, this is another one. I really need to do a whole show on just shooting in manual. First of all, there's nothing wrong with shooting in manual. Okay. Manual's fine, but here's the problem. It's a myth that you have to shoot in manual. I see this repeated over and over and over again, where people will repeat this in forums and groups saying, oh, you got to get off auto. You got to get off auto. Only professionals shoot in manual. Excuse me. That is absolutely not true. I shoot in a 90%, maybe 75% in aperture priority all the time, and I can explain why in a minute. But you do not need to be shooting in manual. And here's an interesting thing. What is the difference between a photo that was shot correctly on manual versus was shot correctly on auto? Nothing. The exposure is exactly the same. F8 at 1/25th of a second at ISO 100 is the same whether the camera selected that information, that exposure, or where you dialed it in manually. The exposure is exactly the same. Manual only complicates things. So whoever tells you to shoot on manual, ignore that advice if you're a new photographer. Now, don't get me wrong. At some point, you'll need to learn more about the ISO triangle. But here's what happens. So they'll bring this up, and they'll post this in a forum, and they'll say, oh, here's what you need to learn. You need to learn the ISO triangle. That's the problem. Not the exposure triangle, and that'll make you a better photographer. Well, this doesn't. I mean, this would be confusing to anybody, even if you've been shooting a while. It doesn't make any sense, but it's what they seem to think that you need to know to make a decent photograph, and that's just not true. You do not need to know all of that right away. So what my advice is to shoot on aperture, on aperture priority, or auto, or program. In other words, let the camera do some of the work for you. Why? If you go to manual, you're basically turning this $1,000 camera into a 1960s film camera that shoots everything on manual focus, manual aperture, manual shutter speed, manual ISO. It doesn't make sense. Let the camera do some of the work for you. Now, what you should be focusing on, though, is composition. Learn composition. I don't care if you even have an iPhone. Learn how to frame a picture correctly. Learn lighting. Learn to see the lighting and how light falls and how it acts. And then learn how to frame a picture and how to pose a person if you're photographing people. Those are the most important things. That is what will make a picture important and get people what people call wow factor, not whether you're shooting on manual, not whether you're shooting on aperture priority, not whether you're shooting on auto. So it's what the image looks like, not what mode you shot it in. Now, at some point, you'll have to learn how these things interact, how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO interact. When you change one, then you have to change the other. But you don't need to start that way. Ease into it. Because what happens is the people that I've noticed that I teach, when you start trying to go into this stupid aperture or exposure triangle, people get confused. They get overwhelmed. They get frustrated, and then they want to quit. So don't worry about that right now. Worry about what's in front of your lens and how to take interesting photos. The rest will happen, I promise you. In fact, it's the easiest thing to teach. I can teach someone the exposure triangle much easier than I can teach them how to see. Learning to see, how to interpret an image is much more important and much more difficult. So anyway, that's my rant on manual. So hopefully that's why the reason the pictures are dark is they're just frankly underexposed because you don't understand what's going on. You try and people say, "Oh, what settings did you use?" Well, you can't. I see this one all the time as well. People will look at a great picture. Oh, that's a great picture. What settings did you use? It would not help one bit if you gave them the settings. Oh, I shot it at 2/50th of a second at 1.8 at ISO 100. Well, that means nothing. Where are you? What's the light? What's the exposure? I mean, there's a ton of things that go into those settings, not how close you are to the subject. So the settings aren't important. So the reason her pictures are dark is because she's letting the camera, she's making every decision manually. If Jennifer was to go to aperture priority, let the camera select the shutter speed and the ISO, then her pictures would come out much better. And the other thing I notice is people talk about shooting on manual. I never once hear them talk about learning how to read a histogram. That's a whole nother issue. Okay, so the next, again, if you have a question, feel free to leave it in the comments on the Facebook page or on the YouTube page. If you get to the YouTube page, it's youtube.photomentor.tv. And if you're on the YouTube page and you want to get to the Facebook page, it's facebook.photomentor.tv. Put a Q in front of the question with a colon, and it'll pop up here on my screen. I'll be able to answer that real time. Okay, so Carl asked an interesting question. He says, when shooting in manual focus mode, how do you get crisp pictures with no blur? I use matrix. He was on matrix focusing, I think, on portraits. Here's another example. Why would you shoot on manual focus? Now, I shoot manual focus, but that's when I'm shooting video. And I use focus peaking, and I have tools to be able to determine if I'm in focus, because I might want to rack focus. So if in video, I might want to move the focus point from one point to another. But a still picture, you're not. These cameras nowadays have very, very sophisticated focusing systems. Let the camera do the focusing for you. I wouldn't recommend using matrix focusing though. I would recommend using spot focusing, the center focus. Place that focusing point on the eye of the person that are a group of people, portrait, and then let the camera pick the rest of that. The other thing that people don't realize is that the focusing plane is this way. It's not this way. Meaning, if I focus on a person here and there's somebody behind them over here, they're going to be out of focus. So the plane works this way, not this way. All right, so you need to understand what aperture to use so that the focus is going to give you enough depth of field to be able to get everybody in focus. So I would say use autofocus. If you're doing a group of people or something and you're concerned, shoot at 4.5, 5.6. If you need to do that, and shoot single point focusing, single spot focusing on that. So anyway, I hope that helps, Carl. Okay. Julie asked, how common is it to use presets? Do you edit more after using one? Do you edit more after using one? So I assume Julie's talking about a preset on something like Luminar or on Lightroom. So presets are fine. Okay, what a preset does is that after you made adjustment of the photo, you can then store those settings and then you can apply them to multiple pictures later on. They're fine. I'll often use presets. I'll create one for every setting. Maybe if I'm doing even portraits, so a group of people, business portraits, for example, I may create a preset and then use that on all the people's photos, so they'll match. The white balance saves me having to change white balance or any kind of other contrast or saturation. But the problem is, keep in mind that a preset's only good for that session. In other words, as soon as you turn and take another picture somewhere else and the light changes, that same preset may not apply. So in other words, a preset that works on a portrait may not work for a product photography. Product photography may want to be more accurate. The colors need to be right on the money. There may be, especially if it's going in a catalog. But for a portrait, you can get away with different kind of presets. So you can set different presets up, black and white, things like that. And they're fine to use, but keep in mind you may need to tweak them from time to time, and they don't apply to every situation. So, and they're very easy to create. I don't understand why people say, "Oh, I love your preset. Can you send that to me?" Well, why would you want a preset that somebody else uses? You want your own. You want to create your own style. What looks good to you may look not good to somebody else. So you want to create your own style, what looks good to you, and that would be your own presets. So, okay. Next question is from Erica, and she says, "I have a Nikon D3400. What lens would you recommend for taking kids' football images?" Well, I used to shoot sports professionally as well, and that's a big question. And sports photography is tough, and the reason is you have two extremes. You have long distances, a 300 millimeter or greater, and in a high school game or amateur game, then there's not much light. A lot of these games are played at night and they're very dark, and so you need that. So that means you need a lens with a wide aperture, and you need a camera that has a very high ISO performance. So that's the difficulty. So I would say, Erica, you could try and rent a 70 to 200 2.8 lens, great lens. There's Nikon makes an excellent lens, which for your D3400, and or you could try a Tamron or a Sigma. Both make a 70 to 200 2.8. All three of those are great lenses and would be something that you would want to try. Now they tend to be kind of expensive. So the least you can get into one, I think, is about $1,400 maybe for a new one. I think that's the Tamron or the Sigma. I forgot. The Nikon's a little more expensive. If you can't afford that, then you could use a 70 to 300 lens. You want about that 300 millimeter, but here's the problem. So they have what they call variable aperture lenses. So 70 to 300, if you'll notice on the inside of the lens, it'll say 3.5 3 or 5.6. What that means is when you're wide open, when you're at 70 millimeter, the lens is going to be at a 3.5 opening. So you're going to get more light. If you don't do anything on the camera, don't change any settings or anything, but if you zoom in to 300, that lens is going to automatically close down to 5.6. And that's just the way they can do that. They have to do that to keep the lenses smaller, lighter, and less expensive. So a fixed aperture, like a 2.8, is going to be 2.8 all the way through, whether you're at 70 or whether you're at 200. Now, keep in mind, when I say a fixed, I don't mean it's only 2.8. You could make it 5.6, and then whenever you zoom in, it's going to stay at 5.6. But the biggest opening would be 2.8, and it's going to stay at 2.8 if you don't change that. So the 7200 is a great lens. It'll spoil you. That would be the one if you can borrow one or rent one to do. If you don't have that, try and get a 70 to 300. Also, Tamron came out with a lens a couple years back, about a year or so back, called an 18 to 400. That's probably the longest lens in one package. That's one lens will get you 18 to 400. The difficulty again is, I think at 400, I think it closes down to 6.3, meaning f 6.3. So you're going to lose quite a bit of light, and that's the drawback there. The other lens you could look at, by the way, would be you could rent the Nikon 200 to 500. That is an outstanding lens. It's about $1,400 if you bought it. It's razor sharp. It's a fixed aperture of 5.6. So those would be something to look at for football. Like I said, kids football is tough because again, you got moving objects, low light typically, and long distances. So the expensive glass is the only way to really capture those kinds of things. Okay, so one thing I want to do here before we go into that, I wanted to show you a picture here. I'm always showing. She's probably gonna get mad at me here. This is a picture that Claudia took. Claudia is a new photographer out of Romania, and doesn't look as sharp here, but believe me, it's a great picture. She just picked up um, a Sigma 105 macro lens, which is really sharp. So I know that this is also sharp. And this is a brush, a makeup brush with glitter, and she's just shaking it with the glitter on it, and it really came up really cool. She did about 3 or 4 of these, and I thought that was an excellent concept that she was working on there. So the reason I show you this is just because it's a different, it's creative. Instead of photographing our dogs or cats or friends or neighbors, here she's trying something a little different, trying to learn lighting and to capture something different. And so this is a very kind of a fine art or a very artistic photo. And so this is just another one of the photos I love that Claudia, she's always coming up with new ones, and I'm always bragging on her because I think she's very talented in the kind of stuff that she works on. So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting idea. She's also doing with water droplets right now, which I've been kind of helping her with, trying to show her how to use a flash to do that. Okay. So Brittany says, does the way your light meter, does the way your camera read light change with the seasons? And the answer would be no, technically. But the way a light meter works is it really assumes everything is gray. It assumes it's what they call an 18% gray. You've probably seen gray cards you can buy. So that's the way that light meter it looks at the entire scene, and it averages out to make it look like what would happen if it was 18% gray. So for example, that's why when you photograph something in snow, the snow doesn't look pure white, because the camera's looking at that and the light meter, and it thinks it looks, oh, that's too bright. I need to bring the exposure down a little bit so that it's properly exposed. The same thing when you are photographing a person in front of a window. The camera sees all the light around the window, and the light meter sees that, and so it brings the exposure down, and so that's how you create a silhouette. If you want to expose for the person, then you'd have to change the settings, and I could go into that, but we won't do it now. So anyway, so her question about does the light meter change in seasons is not accurate, but the light changes. The contrast, the shadows get longer in the winter time, and the seasons change. And so what happens is your exposure may change, but that's because the light is changing. So the light meter is still reading an average of the entire scene, but if you happen to have more shadows than you do bright subjects, like in the summertime, then it will change the way the camera looks at that, and the way it's reading what the light is really there, but it's not the meter is really changing itself. Hope that makes sense. Anyway. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so the next question is from Elena, I think. It says, I shoot with a Nikon D, a lot of Nikon users, with a Nikon D3500, and I'm upgrading to a D750. I'm super excited to switch to full frame. Will I see a big difference? Probably not a huge difference. You'll see a little bit of a difference. The difference will mainly be in maybe a little bit richer color. The saturation might be a little bit more on the colors. And but the biggest difference will be in the lenses are going to be more expensive. They're going to be heavier, but they'll typically be better quality. And so sometimes you'll notice a difference when you if you're using full frame lenses, because the lenses are better. The other thing you'll notice is the depth of field will change, meaning on the smaller the sensor, the greater the depth of field at the same aperture. So in other words, if you're shooting at 1.8 on a crop sensor, and I'll just make this up, let's say maybe this is your depth of field is this much, but when you put a full frame lens at 1.8, the depth of field may only be this much because the sensor's bigger. So the depth of field is in a relationship to the distance of the subject and the size of the sensor and the focal length, of course, of the lens. But so you may notice a little bit of that there. The 750 is a great camera. It's also a better low light camera. It does a much better job at higher ISOs than the D3400 or D3500 does. D3500 is a great camera. I mean, it's probably one of the most popular entry level cameras on the market. But that was where you'll see the difference there. The lenses again are going to be more expensive because they're more glass, better quality, and but you will see a little bit of a difference in the depth of field. Not much. Okay, let's see if we got any new questions coming in. All right. So the next question is, I'm looking to purchase a new lens. Does anyone have the Sigma 105 f2.8? Okay, that's the one I mentioned before that Claudia has. Excellent lens. He doesn't mention what camera he's using, but the Sigma makes that same lens for multiple mounts. You can get it for Nikon, Canon, Sony, and I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. It's a great lens. It's very sharp. Tamron also makes one. Tamron makes a 90 millimeter 2.8, which is also a good lens. And of course, Nikon has a 105 2.8 macro lens, and Canon has a 100 millimeter 2.8 macro lens. And the reason, and I assume that's what he's talking about, is the macro lens here. Sigma also makes a 105 1.4 lens. That lens is amazingly sharp, and the contrast and the color is just gorgeous. Now it's huge. It's a monster lens. I don't have a picture of it here, but it's massive. The thing weighs a ton. It's the only 105 millimeter lens I've ever seen that actually has a collar for a tripod. It's that big, but it's a gorgeous piece of glass. But anyway, so I'm sure he's talking about the macro lens here, which is the 2.8, and good lens. So the reason you would get a 105, let's say, because they make different macro lenses, you can get a 60 millimeter macro or a shorter or a longer one. The reason you want something about 105 is because if you're photographing flowers or insects or things like that, you don't want to get too close to the subject because then you'll scare it away. So the 105 lets you get far enough back, still get a 1-to-1 magnification. In other words, it's going to fill the screen. But it will also be it'll give you far enough distance, but it'll also be sharp enough and everything to get the kind of image that you want. So like I have a 105 2.8 macro for my Nikon, and I use it for product photography primarily. And the nice thing about that is I don't have to get too close. So if I have lights that I'm lighting an object with, product for a client, then I don't want to get too close because then I'm going to have shadows falling in on the product. And so the 105 is really good for that for me. Okay. Next, let's see what else we got. Okay, April asks, when releasing photos to clients for print release, do you remove your logo or keep it on the photo? I would not watermark anything that I gave to a client. If they've paid for it and you've released it to them, then you're going to want to not have a watermark on the photo. Now, what you could do, what some photographers will do, is they'll sign the back of the photo, or if they put it in a mat, they'll sign the mat. But you can put it on the back of the photo and your information on the back of there, but you don't want to put it as a watermark on the photo. Wouldn't make sense. And also, I'm not a big one on watermarks anyway, I'll be honest with you. I had this discussion with a lot of people. I think a watermark, I think it looks amateurish. I've never put a watermark on any of my professional photos that I've shot on my website or give them to clients. And I don't know any other, maybe wedding photographers might do that, but for the most part, people don't put watermarks on their pictures. And also they're typically big and gaudy looking, and people think it's going to protect them from people stealing their pictures. It won't. And it detracts from the image. If you have this beautiful image and you got this big signature over in the corner, what's the person going to see when their eyes going to go to the signature? So you're really ruining the aesthetics of the photo by putting a watermark. But that's just my opinion. I know other people have different opinions. I don't believe it. I don't think it makes sense myself. So I hope that helps, April. Okay. Alicia asks, I have a Canon T7i, which is a good entry-level camera, by the way. Is there a way I can mute the sound of the shutter and the beeping noise when I'm taking pictures? There's not much you can do with the shutter. I know on the Nikon they have a quiet mode. I don't know if the Canon does or not. For the most part, though, Canons have a fairly quiet shutter. To turn off the beeping sound, that's set up for autofocus. When your camera reaches in autofocus and it locks in, you get that double beep. You can turn that off, and so that you don't have that going on if you're in the middle of a shoot. But as far as the shutter, there's not a whole lot you can do from that. Again, the Canons tend to be fairly quiet. Mirrorless cameras have no noise. You can actually do electronic shutter instead of a mechanical shutter if you go into the quiet mode. In fact, it's a little bit disconcerting. I've shot mirrorless, and when you push the button, you don't know if you've taken the picture or not. It's you have to actually look at it. Some cameras will actually they'll light up a box around the outside of the frame in the viewfinder to show you that you've taken the picture. But it's so quiet that you don't really even know if you've taken a picture or not. It's kind of tough. Okay. All right. I think that's it for tonight. So, again, we do this every Friday night at 9 p.m. And if you would like to join us again, and again, you can, as I said before, you can send if you want to send a question to answer directly, you can do that by sending an email to help@photomentor.tv, or you can join us next week again. Just leave a comment. You can leave a comment on this question here, even though we won't be live next week, or that won't be the same question. But I'll pick up on it and I'll add it to the list. And again, thanks for joining us. I'm glad you guys did. And if there's anything we can do in the future, be sure and leave me an email if you have any questions. And I also appreciate if you'd like the page here, the Photo Mentor TV Facebook page, and also on the YouTube page. I also appreciate if you give us a like and a thumbs up on that. So it kind of lets us know that you're out there, you're listening, and that you want us to keep continuing. Again, thanks very much, and talk to you next week at the same time, Friday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time.